The Kelly Lectures are named from the Thomas James Kelly Chair, which I occupy, a gift to the University of Louis and Louise Nippert. And it is my feeling that the occupiers of such chairs should do homage to their patrons. That is one reason for these lectures, that it seems to me important that one return to a chair something in the way of music or scholarship. And so I will make this an annual series of 3 lectures given at various seasons in the future, in which there will be music and a short address on subjects, of course, which will vary. This year, the composer looked at in various perspectives. I spoke the other day on composer and tradition and tried to deal with some of the problems of what might be called that which is behind the composer. Every composer who starts with a blank page or a blank mind or interior silence, and sometimes those stages of starting with the blank page last on and cause endless anguish. But nonetheless, I tried to deal with some of the problems anterior, so to speak, to the beginnings, the makings, the procedures. To me, composing and the processes of composing start with notions about the field of choice. The first problem for me, as I begin a new work or a series of works, is what is the field of my choice? And to some extent, anterior notions, anterior experience, anterior conventions play a part in that. Sometimes more, sometimes less. But I spend a great deal of time, and I think most composers do spend a great deal of time, in concerning themselves with expanding or narrowing or choosing from fields of choice. This may be in part because I have always had a rather strong mathematical bent. I've studied a good deal of mathematics, feel comfortable with notions of realms and domains and fields and matrices and lattices and so on. And therefore, the field of choice, how to limit it, how to skew it, how to turn it from a trapezoid, so to speak, to a rhomboid, from a rhomboid to an octagon. Those questions interest me a great deal, and the more I study about music of other composers, the more I feel that these concerns about the field of choice, particularly to do perhaps with shapes, sometimes with ranges of expression, sometimes with purposes of one kind or another. But if you start off a composition ignoring notions of the field of choice, it seems to me it's a sure sign of trouble somewhere along around 2/3 of the way. I notice as I study the notebooks of a Beethoven or the letters of a Schoenberg, or even the letters of Verdi, marvelous craftsman that he was, there's a great deal of concern, not expressed perhaps with the phrase field of choice, but impinging on the notion of field of choice. In other words, decisions long before one is concerned with sonic images, temporal features, design, various attitudinal postures, there is the narrowing or enlarging of the field of choice. Following decisions about the field of choice, what sort of a piece this will be, what range of meaning shall I attempt to convey, is the whole notion of invention. And I might quote here a remarkable paragraph from an essay by Jacques Adimar on the psychology of invention in the mathematical field. This is a quite splendid essay on the way in which the creative mathematicians, the Kroneckers, the Gausses, tended to work their creative process, if you will. The quotation reads, "To invent is to choose." It's a very startling statement. To invent is to choose. This very remarkable conclusion, I'm continuing the quotation, appears the more striking if we compare it with what Paul Valéry writes in the Nouvelle Revue Française. This is a quotation included now from Valéry. "It takes two to invent anything. The one makes up combinations, the other one chooses, recognizes what he wishes and what is important to him in the mass of the things which the former has important to him. What we call genius is much less the work of the first one than the readiness of the second one to grasp the value of what has been laid before him and to choose it." End of quotation. That's a quite remarkable quotation, and it helps me to understand the ways in which important theorems are solved, important basic questions in mathematics are solved. The notion, in other words, of a double function, that invention, and I'm extrapolating to obviously the invention of a composer now, the invention of a composer is in fact an obverse process, a process in which there is a clear parallax kind of function between two operations, two personalities. And as a composer, I find myself constantly in the position of choosing, and that process of choosing, of course, relates to the first point I made of the determinations of fields of choice. The readiness of the second one to grasp the value of what has been laid before him. In other words, at every point, in other words, in the creative process, in the matter of devising music, making music, one is choosing, one is selecting, one is taking from some mass that which is imperfect, improving it, refining it, modifying it, transmuting it, as I said the other day, transforming it, referring back to the previous lecture. To continue with some other quotations on this general subject, a short and quite profound statement of the mathematician Abel. "Instead of seeking a relationship whose existence we do not know, we should ask if such a relationship is possible." Instead of seeking a relationship whose existence we do not know, we should ask if such a relationship is possible. That bears very much on this question of the second person in the equation, choosing. We should ask that second person if such a relation is possible, possible in the contexts which, of course, the composer devises. Or another quotation on the same general line from the great geometrician Minkowski. "If we are able to separate one form out of the innumerable many forms of a class through definite conditions, such a so-called reduced form in a certain measure presents a complete invariative system of the class." Close quote. That's a little murky, I admit. If we are able to separate one form out of the innumerable many forms, that's invention, of a class through definite conditions, such a so-called reduced form in a certain measure presents a complete invariative system of the class. Well, we're moving, as I move ahead with you here, to notions of invention. And I think invention is, to the layman, rather more easy to understand in the notion of a young and brilliant Thomas Alva Edison, puttering around in a laboratory, searching his destiny on some rather eccentric and quirky notion, perhaps. But these quotations from the great mathematicians perhaps better describe the generalized aspects of invention. The co-equivalency of choice out of an array. Mathematicians are always dealing with what they call arrays. And they're always trying to make sense, to make order out of arrays. Perhaps the term field of choice would be easier to understand if we substituted in part for it array. Now, in the creative process, invention is indispensable. There is no significant composing without significant, meaningful invention. Inventions must be clever, they must be discriminating, they must be sometimes amusing, they must be well managed. And that leads to a word that it's all composers are involved with from their earliest times to the last piece they write. That word is technique. It's an abused word, and it's easier to understand perhaps in terms of all of us who are instrumentalists. We all aspire to have the best possible technique, meaning that capacity to render most perfectly, most purely, most definitively that which we concern ourselves with. Well, a composer is concerning himself with these choices out of arrays of possibilities, these selections from a mass, and he uses his technique. What is the proper technique of a composer? Well, a composer's technique never stops, of course. There is no such thing as arriving at a technique. I am now technically finished. I now have a technique. No composer worth anything stops gaining in technique. As one studies any significant major composer, a Josquin or a Stravinsky, a Haydn or a Webern, one is aware all through the life, the creative life, of not only maturation of musical products, significant higher ranges of expressivity, but of constant increase in technique. Constant increase in technique. Well, technique, in one sense, means wrestling with the paradox, continuous wrestling with the paradox of things being easier to manage, but the perceptions of the management possibilities becoming harder. You can manage things which you used to do with greater facility, but if your technique genuinely grows, you are aware, of course, of a new range, a new horizon, a new set of limits, so that your technique must grow continuously to accommodate them. I have been the lucky recipient, as some of you know, of a fine classical education. That classical education has given me the sense of the need for an orderly progress in acquiring technique. Classical education deals with languages and mathematics and with the control of both. And as one gains technique as a composer, one, it seems to me, builds constantly in terms of that facility, always, hopefully, a bit ahead of the materia, always just a little ahead of the problems. Technique implies ease, and yet, at the same time, technique always involves a real technique, a struggle. I don't think of technique, obviously, as I'm talking of it now, in any sense of that which one has and that which one uses. I think of it, of course, as a process. Technique involves a process of new discovery, of possibilities. And I think this is equally true of the fine performer. I cannot think of a performer such as, for example, Menuhin, who plays a very small repertory and plays it differently in every decade. There is mind, there is technique at work there. But this classical education I spoke of involves for me also the notion of acquiring skills. Technique involves skills. And the composer today, it seems to me, often finds the acquisition of skills, the handling of notes, the concerns of identifications of images, the concerns of the whole matter of managing time, all those aspects of technique which we take for granted in a fine performer, a composer these days is sometimes neglectful of. And I think that it's part of the obligation, so to speak, of educators to keep pointing out that technique is not finite, it is not closed, it is not encapsulated, it cannot be, so to speak, acquired totally. There is always an open end at the funnel. But on invention, there must be technique. I find music which interests me, and always have found that music which interests me, I immediately become interested in the technique. If this piece today strikes a responsive chord in any sense whatever to those of you, and I look out and see many musicians, of course, among you, then the proper response, from my point of view, is curiosity about the technique. What is the process used? How do those notes get into those shapes? What attitudes were there about dynamic control? What were the viewpoints expressed here on texture? What were the attitudes about harmony? Was harmony a factor or a negligible quantity? Was there a sense of melodic invention and melodic curvature? So on. Those are questions, of course, which are technical questions. And as one composes, one, so to speak, is constantly wrestling with those technical questions. Technical questions involve technique. I am always fascinated at a concert of new music by what is the technique. Not so much what is the meaning, that comes much later, but what is the technique? Technique involves, and composing along with it, the matter of exclusions. A lovely quotation now from Giorgio Vasari, the great biographer of painters of the Renaissance. Sculpture, as he says, is an art which, by removing all that is superfluous from the material under treatment, reduces it to that form designed in the artist's mind. Sculpture is an art which, by removing all that is superfluous from the material under treatment, reduces it to that form designed in the artist's mind. A technique which does not involve exclusions is a paltry technique, an insignificant technique, a minor technique. An invention which does not involve extraction from the array and also, of course, significant rejections in the array, is a feeble process. The strong process of composing, from my point of view, is the process of what might be called continuous exclusion of material. It is not nearly so much what is there in this vast possible choice as what is omitted, what is left out, what is there for another piece, for another time and another occasion. Music which is too stuffed full is the commonplace of our time, seems to me. Music too stuffed full, too many ideas, too many notes, too many triple fortissimos of the brass, too little exclusion. So I confess that composing for me is a process of picking out, erasing, cutting out surgically, chopping up, thinning out, winnowing. And I guess it's partly the concept of pruning. It's springtime now. We are pruning. If we have any kinds of shrubs or bushes which we care about, we have pruned them or recognize the need for pruning. And pruning is a kind of familiar word to describe what exclusions, of course, does in a generalized sense. Music without pruning, too stuffed full, notey, is the curse of every age, but particularly ours, it seems to me. I like to think of Vasari's definition: removing the superfluous from all that image which is in the form of the artist's mind. So clever. He doesn't talk about chipping away or shaping things. He's talking about the mind. And of course, it's that exclusion of that too muchness which is in the mind, which we need. A composer, in the process of composing, of course, deals with material. We hear the word, we use the word constantly, material. And we make judgments constantly about materials. When we stop to think of it, the most common judgment we make about music, after we have assessed its technique, after we have attempted to come to grips with the inventive properties of the music, is to form some judgments on the materials. Obviously, a piece of music has material. It has stuff. It is composed of silences, blank spots, vivid spots, openings, grill work of one kind or another. And it seems to me that the vigilance of the composer in testing what might be called the banality quotient, the vulgarity quotient, the quotient of vulgar speech, is a very critical and often neglected property in the writing of music. There is, of course, the rare creative person who is able to take the most banal material and transmute it. Coming out the other day, listening to the first version of the last movement of the Eroica Symphony, I couldn't help but think, well, there is the first and most banal material which leads to the ecstasies of the last movement of the Eroica Symphony of Beethoven. And I don't mean to say that the transformatory process on banal material is not one of the glorious experiences in the creative process. But still, one does look at material, and one is right to question it. A composer questions his material all the time. He must ask himself, does this suit? Does it fit? Again, the mathematical notion of fit. Does it fit the circumstance, the issue, the occasion? And I believe that the exercise of taste is quintessential. If the material is not put through the sieve of one's severest canons of taste, I think one risks a great deal of storm and fury to no purpose in music. I enjoy fastidious music. I like music in which the material is not banal, over music in which there is even the most extraordinary transformatory process. The tests of material, of course, are among the most personal tests. I'm moving, in a sense, through this 45 minutes from generalized ideas of some complexity into very personal ideas. When one comes to material, one is dealing with extremely personal choices. Such and such a series of notes, such and such a sequence works for you. It's material which is meaningful, valid, correct, true, orderly. Other material is not. Those involve the most personal choices and, of course, lead ultimately to the personal language. The dimensions of time. All music, every composition involves a whole series of decisions, a whole series of agonizing points of time. Agonizing because the slightest shifts are so terribly critical. And when you add on to the conceptual, the pre-performance notions of time possibilities, that whole extra area of the performer's role, the shaping force of the performer, and the fact that you are dealing with a blueprint in a way, hoping to lead the performer into understanding. The dimensions of time, again, even more personal. I find decisions about the length of a piece, about the proportions of a piece, about the microseconds, if you will, among the most difficult. I think it's true of every composer that the time dimension problem is the most subtle, the most elusive, the most baffling, the most mysterious of all the questions in the creative process. There are, in this case, the least prior help, the least experience possible, because the real decisions about time dimension in music, if they be not mechanical, of course spring from the most interior physiologic and spiritual sources. It is there that the composer faces all those notions of the clock, the psychological time, the musical time clock, the chronological time clock, the time clock of the subconscious, the time clock of the supraconscious. Those are all different times, and they're all operating at the same moment, and the task of music, in a way, is to reveal to us aspects of those different time clocks. Therefore, whether your piece is a light and gay and relatively open piece, or a work of great interior complexity, the time dimension is always there. And the success or failure of a piece is intimately tied up with possible right or possible wrong decisions about those time dimensions. The composer in his process is always worried about purposes and intent. purposes and intent. What is the purpose for which one is writing? Is it a public purpose? Is it a private purpose? Is it an open purpose? Is it a secondary purpose? I believe it's all very well to talk about music in some idealized fashion, music only in terms of that which has been produced, but I gather that today we are all addressing together in some manner the notion of the process, the betwixt problem, following the anteriors of the tradition and the shaping forces that get into everybody's consciousness who writes, and prior to the finished work, there is this interesting and very, very difficult process. Purpose is important. This sonata which you just heard has a number of purposes. They're not very important now. They're of little consequence now, years after the composition was written. But at the time, those purposes were very highly supportive to me and highly important in the shape of the piece. I was concerned very much at this time with the question of tonocentricity. I was attempting to involve myself with processes of composition involving cyclical forms, cyclical structures, but at the same time having a secondary layer of organization with tonal forces. This was an attempt, in other words, to reconcile what at the period in which I wrote the piece were considered to be almost irreconcilable integrative methods. In other words, one purpose, perhaps now completely submerged, I hope so, because these purposes tend to be unimportant later on, but at the time, the question, could you integrate a piece of music, give it meaning, wholeness, in adopting two completely polarized techniques antipodal to each other? Well, perhaps the charitable answer is no, having heard the piece. But nonetheless, that was one of the purposes, to see if one could do this. And this raises the question also of an approach which must be obvious in the several pieces of mine that you've now heard, that I am attracted by the setting up of and the solution of problems. Again, may I say that the solution and setting up of problems is unimportant perhaps in the final stage, but I happen to like to work that way. I like to set problems of great difficulty and then attempt to solve them. Not all composers work this way. Some composers feel uncomfortable with that mode and don't like it. They pursue other kinds of processes. Mine is very much involved with setting problems, often of a kind in which ambiguities and antipodal positions are felt, and the tension created by their resolution is part of the tension of the final work. Another aspect of the creative process, for me, is the determination of problems of rhetoric and diction. Rhetoric and diction, those aspects of the flow thought of in linguistic terms of the music. We use words in music like continuity, the continuity of the piece, how one section follows logically or not onto another. And those, in classical terms, again, are often matters of rhetoric and diction. I look for a diction in which, to quote from a wonderful letter of Mark Rothko's of some years back, single sentence, quote, "We favor the simple expression of the complex thought. Mark Rothko, writing to the New York Times, saying, "We favor the simple expression of the complex thought." That is a canon for me and always has been, the simple expression of the complex thought, not the complex thought of the simple. This complex expression of the simple thought, but the simple expression of the complex thought. And those canons tend to relate to the way in which you deal with rhetoric and diction. Rhetoric is, so to speak, the shaping of the linguistic flow. And I always feel in music the very close relationship of language. I'm drawn to vocal music. I've written a lot of it. I feel comfortable with the words, not only the setting of words, but the analog which words give to me in terms of diction and flow. Poetry, for me, has a very important seminal influence, because as I read poetry of different eras, I feel different pulses, different diction, different rhetoric, and those differences in rhetoric and diction help me to shape the flow of my musical language. The quotation from Jonathan Bentall in an interesting essay called "Science and Technology in Art Today." Quotation is, "Perhaps the most difficult and controversial issue in linguistics today is the relationship between semantics and syntax. Semantics and syntax. Nothing comparable to the syntax of natural language appears to be present in comparable animal signal systems, and it may be hazarded that the development of syntax gave man a special, powerful tool for ordering the experience of his environment." It's an interesting statement that syntax gives us a special power of control over experience. I think it's true. And in a way, when I use the terms diction and rhetoric, I might not be so bad off if I replace them with the terms semantics and syntax. The syntax of music is a concern ever present in my processes of writing, and I think those of most composers. Syntax obviously comprehends grammar, but of course is much more elaborate than grammar. Grammar is, so to speak, the passive, dormant, canonical aspect of syntax, and syntax itself is a large word which describes essentially the articulations of language. One's decisions about syntax, long sentences or short sentences, attitudes about clauses, attitudes about paragraphing, attitudes about the dash. All those attitudes have musical analogs, and sloppy syntax, careless syntax, which we of course hear constantly in the ever-present media, is another curse. And poets and musicians should be constantly worried about correct syntax. And of course, correct syntax doesn't mean academic speech. It can mean frantically radical and hectic and hysterical speech. But it is, of course, another form of the ordering of experience. Process, for a composer, always involves one more additional point, which is the matter of visibility and invisibility. At various periods of music, we've had radically different viewpoints on the matter of visibility and invisibility of process. That music in which the process is, so to speak, invisible, in which we are not aware of manipulation, in which technique recedes, in which expression is far front, in which the stereotypic language, conventionalized language, is so strong that the process, so to speak, is submerged. Those aspects of visibility and invisibility are fascinating basic questions as you write. Do you wish your processes to be overt or to be essentially very behind in the music? And I confess that for me this is an interesting problem, and I change. I think most composers tend to like to change, to write some pieces where the processes are overt and other pieces where they are very carefully concealed, where their invisibility is far behind the superficie of the music. One is not right and one is not wrong. One is not better and one is not worse, but they are radically different in terms of the way you go about writing. If you go about writing consciously with the notion of visible process, with high degrees of auditory emphasis on gestures of one kind, it's a different kind of music. It's a different kind of language from the kind of music in which that is all suppressed. And it seems to me that in the emotional range and in the meaningful range and the semantic spectrum, if you will, both kinds of process are very important. Now, I'll be concluding in just a second. I avoided all afternoon, I think, talking about some of the well-known problems of writing music, decisions about design, decisions about using forms known and working within them as against searching out one's new form, questions of details of texture, because most of us in this room are preoccupied continuously with the daily problems of a technique, with the daily problems of invention. And I thought it might be useful to deal with some of the generalized problems behind all this. I hope you do understand that there will be a third in this series, and the title of that is Composer in Expression. I would have worried if you leave this afternoon with the notion of a dehumanized pedant on the stand here who gives you the impression that the composer's process excludes meaning and expression and sensibility. It is not that it is excluded, it is that it is reserved for another hour in which the most difficult of all problems for the composer, the expressivity factor, I'll try to deal with as best I can. So when I talk about composer and process, I'm really concerned with issues like invention and technique and exclusions, purposes, dimensions of time, rhetoric and diction, and visibility and invisibility. But of course, music is a human statement, no matter how much technology is involved. And I hope next Tuesday to share with you some thoughts about the most resistant of all subjects, the composer and expression. Thank you.